So in Christianity, there's a gray area or a Venn diagram between what is man's will and what is God's will. God's will carried out by Providence, executing his designs for the world and the people in it, and then man's will, what we can do of our own will, of our own volition, to carry our lives forward in the directions that we objectively choose. This is the big divide. And you'll find that in a lot of ways it's like a spectrum. There's some people who very much lean on man's will, that man can choose to respond to grace, that is his choice to make. There's people who fall on the other side, where providence is so deterministic that it determines our nature such that even when we act freely, we are still carrying out the roles we are designed to play. And this is the fundamental disagreement. It's one of many fundamental disagreements. And I want to speak on it, and I found a mathematical model that can shed some light onto that contextualizes how we can portray this debate. So this over here is called, it's Cantor dust. And what it effectively is you take a line, then you cut out a third, so there's two lines, then you cut out a third again, and you cut out a third again, and you find that as the Cantor dust falls, that mathematically speaking, it all equals the same thing, but it's almost infinite in capacity. Well, I want to draw a correlation here between, or just using the Cantor dust as an example to frame my argument about providence. And it's more of a question than anything. And I want to take us back to the life of our dear friend Fred. So now Fred's in his early 20s, and he finds he has 3 large events that happen to him that are deterministic about the course of his life moving forward. And we have previously defined a providential moment, if you want to call it that, as when you are in the right place at the right time, you're thinking the right thing, you have the right heart posture, and your upbringing was such that when you have the chance to act, you do or say the thing that directly causes the next period of your life to unfold. It's all contingent upon that thing. And then when you look back retrospectively years in the future, you'll find that you actually didn't have any other chance but to do this thing, because if you hadn't done this one thing that you were perfectly primed to do, your entire life would have unfolded differently. So those are providential moments for sake of vocabulary. Now let's say our dear friend Fred has 3 of these providential moments throughout his early 20s. Gets a girlfriend, changes his life. Gets a job he never thought he'd get in a million years, but he gets it, and then he ultimately comes to Christ. Let's say it happens over the course of 1 year. So when we think about those providential moments, the first place to put emphasis will be on the initial event. So Fred meets the perfect girlfriend. Let's say he goes to a bar he's been to a million times. He happens to see her there, and she's so beautiful, he just has to talk to her. They hit it off. He gets her digits. They go out a couple times, maybe an activities bar, maybe a couple strolls, maybe a couple movie nights, and they slowly begin to fall for each other. He gets the perfect job. You know, he was working really hard as an accountant, and he really wanted to get into the forensic side of things, and he definitely had the resume and the school to do it, but let's say for sake of argument, it's such a selective field. But he happened to meet the right guy at a company luncheon who was visiting the firm, who had the contact information for someone who was hiring at his dream firm. And then when he comes to Christ, Fred has one final moment. He's in a prayer circle, and he prays, and he realizes for the first time, he believes that someone is hearing his prayers. So these are Fred's 3 big providential moments. And we understand that in each of those moments, sitting at the bar, seeing her, he knew he had to. He couldn't let this go. He was ready to make that happen. Or sending in the application to the forensics firm with the guy writing him a letter of recommendation. All of his professional career, his academic career, came to a head in this moment. And then we see when he ultimately comes to Christ that his heart is able to move with such certainty that he accepts the truth once and for all. All 3 of these are providential moments. But then we start talking about the Cantor dust. And let's go back 2 weeks. So what happened in Fred's life 2 weeks before all 3 of these events? Well, with the girl at the bar, he went there and he struck out. He struck out big time with one of the prettiest girls he'd ever seen. And he went home that night defeated, and as he sat on his couch watching cartoons, he decided, you know what? I'm not going to let that happen to me again. And then we go to the job. Let's say 2 weeks before he submitted that application, before he made that correction, his boss let him know that he didn't have any track for promotion for the next 2 years. And then before he came to Christ, we see that 2 weeks before that, his mom, who's always been a Christian, who always wanted him to open his eyes to the faith, had something really hard happen in her life, and he witnessed her resolve and how she was able to still stand up straight even as this hard thing was happening. That she still had faith, she still had confidence in God and trust that thy will be done. And he was moved by her resolve. He felt for her being in the situation, but he was moved by her resolve. So now we've taken it back 2 weeks. And then let's just keep taking it back. So starting with the girl. Fred used to go to another bar with a friend, but he's no longer friends with that friend because that guy would just take things way too far with the drinking. And he always hangs out there. So he decided that he wanted to separate, so it means he had to move locations. We'll go back even more. Fred is on Instagram and he sees that his ex-girlfriend is happily in a new relationship. And he's crushed. It takes him weeks to get over it. But he realizes ultimately that she's happy without him and he can be happy without her. And then we go back to college where Fred was with a girl and it seemed like they were going to go the distance. It seemed like they were going to move to the same city to be with each other. And over the course of that last semester, he just fell out of love with her and he couldn't stop it and he hated that he did, but he did anyway. And then we go all the way back to Fred at 13 years old when his knucklehead friend got a girlfriend and he thought to himself, that guy is so much better off now. And we see going back over time, this narrative playing out. And now let's do the job. So we already know he meets the connection. He's at the accounting firm. His boss tells him he's not on track for a promotion. So now we go back. He has a really annoying coworker who sits right next to him. He likes the job. He's good at it, but this guy is just incessantly there, and he's incessantly not going anywhere. We go back. Fred choosing between 2 accounting jobs in 2 different cities. He decides to pick the one that's closer to home, even though it's not as equal as an opportunity, maybe it pays a little less. And then we go back all the way to Fred's freshman year of college. In his first accounting course, the professor said something and Fred challenged it, and he challenged it, and he challenged it because he really thought the guy was wrong. And whether or not Fred or the professor was correct, the professor remembers that Fred had the gall to challenge him. So when he ultimately writes a letter of recommendation for Fred's first accounting job, which remember is the precursor for him getting the forensic accounting job, he writes Fred's letter and makes it a little bit stronger, a little bit more certainty, adding more credentials than Fred than he would have otherwise if Fred hadn't have one day decided, you know what, I don't think you're right, I'm going to say something about it. And then we go back to coming to Christ. So we already know Fred finds comfort in prayer, he finds comfort in his mom's resolve, and we see Fred a year earlier going to a church and really trying it out, but he just can't quite hack it. He just doesn't quite believe how he wants to believe. And then we see Fred going back, and we see him having friends who were involved in the campus ministry, and they were just friends. It wasn't a ministry thing, but he got to know them, he heard them out, and he even argued back against them when they would argue for the faith, and it became like an intellectual thing for him and for them. And then we can go back even further to high school, where one of Fred's good friends comes from a womb-to-tomb household, and he always knew they were different. They had a level of confidence, a level of trust, a level of levity, even from a young age, that he couldn't quite understand. And he always found that interesting. And then we go all the way to the future. And you see what I've done there? You're creating these intervals wherein each interval becomes a precursor for the next interval to transpire. So if we agree that Providence was active in those three key moments in Fred's early 20s, we have to sit there and ask ourselves, what about 2 weeks before that? What about 2 weeks before that? Etc., etc. Because it would have been the same Fred with the same capacity to choose, the same providential forces working on him in order to curate his being in such a way that he would choose, and he did choose, but he progressively chose. One choice goes into the next, until you realize 3 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, that not only could you not have gone a different direction in that one instance, you couldn't have gone a different direction in any of the preceding 12 instances that were the precursor to that final ultimate incident. Oh, I just wanted to present that argument. I'm not here to answer the question today, but I hope I gave you something to think about. Thank you, and God bless.